The Ultimate Warrior was one of wrestling's most unforgettable characters in the late 80s and early 90s, but behind the face paint was one of the most divisive figures in wrestling history. He was a man with a fiery temper and a high opinion of himself, and he didn't suffer fools gladly. In today's video, we're taking a look at the wrestlers who clashed with the Ultimate Warrior and ended up on his bad side. If there's one name that defined wrestling in the 1980s, it's Hulk Hogan. But while millions of fans worshipped the Hulkster, the Ultimate Warrior wasn't exactly lining up to join his fan club. It all started at WrestleMania 6 in 1990. Warrior defeated Hogan cleanly in the main event, which was a rare occurrence at the time. Hogan had spent the better part of a decade as the WWF's untouchable megastar, but this was supposed to be a passing of the torch where Hogan stepped aside for Warrior. But that never happened, and even in defeat, Hogan was still a far bigger superstar. Hogan was shifting more merchandise, he was still paid more, and the fans still preferred him over the Ultimate Warrior. Warrior was seriously pissed off about this, because despite being the WWF champion, he never felt like the company's top star. When Warrior lost the title to Sergeant Slaughter, his frustrations started to boil over. At SummerSlam, he was supposed to be teaming with Hogan to face Sergeant Slaughter, General Adnan and Colonel Mustafa, but at the last minute, Warrior wrote a letter to Vince McMahon outlining a set of demands. He essentially wanted the same deal as Hogan was getting, including equal pay to him, a higher percentage of merchandise sales, creative control over his character, and an upfront payment of $550,000 to appear at SummerSlam. He told McMahon that he wouldn't show up unless his demands were met. McMahon seemingly agreed to Warrior's terms, and so he wrestled the match, but immediately after the show, Vince handed Warrior a letter of his own telling him that he was suspended for 90 days due to unprofessional conduct. By the time Warrior returned to the company in 1992, his relationship with McMahon was already strained, but things were about to get a lot worse. Plans were initially in place to give Warrior another run at the top of the card, with Vince proposing a storyline where he would turn heel by aligning with Mr. Perfect and eventually reclaiming the WWF Championship. But Warrior wasn't happy at all with that plan. He outright refused to turn heel, worried that it would destroy his merchandise sales. And for Warrior, protecting his image as a heroic, larger-than-life character was a combination of both pride and business sense. The rejection forced McMahon to scrap the storyline entirely. At the same time, McMahon was under federal investigation for allegedly supplying steroids to his wrestlers. Regular drugs tests became mandatory in the WWF, and Warrior was tested positive in September 1992, and so McMahon had no choice but to suspend him once again. The steroid trial loomed over Vince at the time, and Warrior saw the suspension as a move to save face with the federal government, even if it meant throwing him under the bus. In retaliation, he stopped showing up for work, and Vince ended up officially firing him in November 1992. From Vince's perspective, Warrior had proven himself time and time again to be difficult to work with, and not just for him, but with other talent backstage too. Rick Rude was not the kind of man to back down from a fight, whether it was verbal or physical, and he was also meticulous in the ring. He prided himself on being a safe worker, and that's why he hated how clumsy and stiff Warrior could be. Warrior, on the other hand, thought that Rude wasn't a big enough name to share the spotlight with him. According to Ric Flair, he didn't think that Rude was good enough to be wrestling him for the Intercontinental title. Rude heard about this and tensions boiled over backstage. He confronted Warrior, and in Flair's words, he beat him up pretty damn good. It's fair to say that Warrior felt that he was above many of his peers in the locker room at the time. He made Jake Roberts jump through hoops just to get his approval. It was 1991 and Vince McMahon had big plans for Jake the Snake, finally giving him the opportunity to break into the main event after years of being in the mid-card. A feud with the Ultimate Warrior was expected to make Jake a main event superstar. It was going to be the next big step in his career, and they'd already started to build towards it on TV. Backstage, Vince told Jake that he needed to visit Warrior in his locker room and ask permission to work with him. Jake couldn't believe what he was being asked to do at the time, but knowing what was at stake, he swallowed his pride and went to see him. According to Jake himself, Warrior launched into a tirade, barking out a bunch of demands. Jake had to show up on time, pass all drugs tests, never miss a show, and essentially stay out of Warrior's way until it was match time. Then came the most cutting remark of all, when Warrior told Jake, "I don't give a fuck about you, your family, or your problems." Warrior made it clear that he didn't respect Jake, and this wasn't a partnership, this was Warrior doing Jake a favour. But in the end, Jake never got his payoff. The SummerSlam situation happened where Warrior was suspended, and Jake was robbed of his chance to break into the main event. For a few years it seemed like the Ultimate Warrior was history, but by 1996 Vince McMahon was in a tough position. Two of his biggest stars in Kevin Nash and Scott Hall had jumped ship to WCW, and amongst the remaining wrestlers, injuries were starting to pile up. Vince had lots of gaps in the roster and he needed a star, so he swallowed his pride and called the Ultimate Warrior. They came to terms and Vince announced Warrior's return on TV, and they did hype it up as a major moment for the company. Triple H was handpicked as Warrior's first opponent at WrestleMania because it was believed that he could make Warrior look good. The original plan was for them to have a competitive match before the Ultimate Warrior eventually got the win, but Warrior had other ideas. As far as Warrior was concerned, he was the megastar and Triple H was just a bottom feeder. And so the match itself lasted under 2 minutes, with Hunter getting in a tiny bit of offense, only for Warrior to immediately no-sell everything, even shrugging off the pedigree. Warrior ran through his signature moves and finished it. According to Bruce Pritchard, Vince McMahon had been watching backstage and he absolutely hated the match. In fact, he was totally furious about it. Next up was a feud with Goldust for the Intercontinental title, which Warrior absolutely hated being a part of. Goldust was one of the most controversial characters in the WWF at the time. He was a sexually ambiguous, gold-painted weirdo who got himself a lot of heat, and not just with the fans. Warrior made no secret of his hatred for the Goldust character, and so the feud was cut short. They did have a match on pay-per-view at In Your House 7, although calling it a match is generous. It was mostly stalling and ended in a count-out victory for Warrior. It was clear that he didn't want to touch Goldust, let alone wrestle him. He moved on to a short-lived feud with Jerry Lawler, and then he was booked in a 6-man tag match at In Your House 9, but in the end, he had to be replaced by Psycho Sid, because in a moment of deja vu from his last run in the company, Warrior had started missing live events without telling anyone. For Vince, this was the tipping point where he realised that things were once again not going to work out between them. Warrior said that his father had recently passed away and he needed time to grieve, and that's why he wasn't showing up for work, but Vince wasn't buying it. He said that that was just an excuse, pointing out that the Warrior hadn't spoken to his dad for over a decade and was never even close to him. Whether Vince's skepticism was justified or not, it demonstrates the lack of trust that existed between them. And for Warrior, Vince's doubts were yet another sign of disrespect. Adding to the tension was Warrior's belief that Vince was selling his merchandise without paying his royalties. Whatever the truth was, the relationship between the men broke down once again. Vince made the decision to fire him just before the In Your House 9 pay-per-view. In 1998, Eric Bischoff signed Warrior to WCW, hoping to make money out of his legendary feud with Hulk Hogan. For Hogan, this was an opportunity to finally get his win back after all these years, so everyone was a winner, apart from the fans. The build-up featured some of the lamest segments WCW had ever produced, including supernatural occurrences like Warrior disappearing in a mirror, and the match itself at Halloween Havoc was even worse. It was filled with botches and overbooked nonsense, and all it served to do was increase Warrior's disdain for the Hulkster. He believed that all of this was a plan between Hogan and Eric Bischoff to make him look stupid. And that was effectively his retirement from wrestling. In the years after, he got a reputation for his angry tirades against his former colleagues. Hogan was the main focus of his rage, but he also took aim at others like Vince and Jake Roberts, accusing them of everything from undermining his career to being morally bankrupt. In one of his more shocking outbursts, he mocked Bobby Heenan, calling him a two-faced bag of shit and stating that the throat cancer that Heenan was suffering from at the time was karma. In 2014, he finally came back to WWE, apparently making peace with Vince McMahon, and he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. Just days later, he died of a heart attack. While Warrior's return to WWE offered a sense of closure, it didn't erase the years of bitterness that he had towards those he worked with.